Hi, my name is Julian Lung at The Fight Site, and this is Painting and Fighting Episode 1. This week we're covering UFC 262, Oliveira vs. Chandler, as well as Tony Ferguson vs. Beneil Dariush, and also Edson Barboza vs. Burgos. This is shaping up to be a really interesting pay-per-view, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about my new project that I've been working on. So let's get into it. So in the last episode of Painting and Fighting, I was painting a squad of Formagons. They're part of the Tyranid race, and I didn't really talk too much about my process and working. But this time I'm actually going to be doing some kit bashing, and I'm going to be kit bashing together some Rebel Armored Grots. If you guys aren't really interested in the backstory and just want to hear me talk about the fights, feel free to skip ahead. So when I first started collecting for 40k, I had originally wanted to collect orcs. The reason why is because I think orcs have the most interesting lore. They're crazy and they're zany, and realistically you can do anything you want with them. And that really attracted me towards the race. However, I found myself really disliking the orc models, mainly because they have this weird protruding butt. So I decided to go with the Tyranids, not really thinking too much about how I was going to collect my army. But after doing some light reading, I found something called the Rebel Grots. Grots, or Gretchen, they serve as cannon fodder, mechanics, medics, and also the occasional food. They're treated extremely poorly in Orc society, as they're one of the smallest and the weakest units in the Greenskin army. As a result, I thought it'd be really interesting to develop an army around the idea that these Grots encountered some really cool, interesting weapons, but they weren't allowed to use them by the Orc masters simply because they're weaker and inferior beings. Growing tired of this, they decided to fight against their masters and took up arms. So, I'm gonna kit bash together some Rebel Grots and paint them up. So to start our painting off, we're going to be painting our grot heads with the base of log flesh, then Warboss green, and then Skarsnik green. I'm going to be using the lighter greens as some highlights, and also mixing some Skarsnik green with some Kislev flesh to create a sort of brown, greenish, patchy look. So now let's talk about the fights. I think this is actually a really interesting fight between Oliveira and Chandler. However, I think this might end up being one-sided for either party. This is because I think Oliveira and Chandler have two distinct styles that really clash against the other. What Chandler likes to do is fight at kickboxing range, and then burst in with a 1-2 or a big right hand or into his double legs. Against Oliveira, I think this will work quite well because Oliveira tends to keep his head very stationary and enters on straight lines. Added to the fact that Oliveira tends to apply the pressure, I can see Chandler easily moving around in and out, bouncing his 1-2s, and really giving Charles a tough time and controlling him on the ground. I think there's a lot to be said about the Tony Ferguson fight, where Oliveira really proved his wrestling chops, but I'm not too sure how this will work against Michael Chandler. For Oliveira, I think this is a really great fight for him as well, albeit with a big caveat. I think Oliveira needs to weather the first round or two and really work on the body of Chandler. Chandler has been known to gas out in later rounds, and he gassed out against Benson Henderson because of his wrestling. I think if Oliveira forces Chandler to shoot horrible shots, he might be able to find some submissions or just be able to light him up across the cage. For our base coat of our armor, we're going to be using some Jocario flesh, the Troll Slayer orange, and the Luganeth orange. I think that while Oliveira has come a long way since his time at featherweight, I do think he has some strategic weaknesses, particularly in his defense. He's a very offensively minded fighter, and I think that's really great. However, he's still very hittable, and he can still really struggle against good counter-strikers. I do think Chandler has the power to equalize the height difference, and we didn't really see much from Hooker that showed Chandler's weaknesses. I think going to the body and going to the legs early for Charles will do really great for him and really pay off later down the line when Chandler is out of energy and trying to shoot for doubles all the time. I don't really see Charles Oliveira finishing Chandler early on because Chandler's most likely going to be coming forward instead of Oliveira. I do think Oliveira might give him a little bit of space and instead needle him with some body kicks and some low kicks. I think there might be an opportunity for Oliveira to meet Chandler with the right uppercut into his right hook, which is one of his favorite combinations, but I'm not too sure how he's going to be able to consistently land against a fighter that wants to consistently take him down and control him. I think there's still a lot about Michael Chandler that we don't quite know much about. He's fought a lot of pretty good competition in Bellator, but he hasn't necessarily fought the best of the best in the UFC. Hooker might have been a pretty good win, however I don't value that very highly in the grand scheme of the lightweight division. So I think this will be a really exciting fight if either fighter gets their way. If they don't, then we get to see some mid-fight adjustments which might really change how we look at either fighter. So for this next painting scheme, we're just going to be continuing highlighting the orange on the armor plates and really putting on double coats for each of the oranges to really make them stick and pop out. I was planning to use some washes, but I decided not to in favor of the highlighting and just practicing blending. So anyways, let's talk about Tony Ferguson versus Beneil Dariush. I think this is a really tough fight for Ferguson, and once again I think the UFC is putting him through the wood chipper. He's had 2 really tough fights against Justin Gaethje and Charles Oliveira, and in each fight he was dismantled in 2 different ways. Against Gaethje, he was more or less outstruck on the feet and really made to eat his counters, and against Oliveira, he was simply out-wrestled and control grappled. I think Beneil Dariush has the right mix of aggression but also takedown threat to really give Ferguson the exact same problems that Oliveira and Gaethje gave him. I'm not really sure what to say about Tony Ferguson's decline. It could be the age, it could also be the injuries, but also just a mental decline. He's been really struggling to put on any good performances, and I can't really think of the last fight where he's really shown his true colors. I like to think that Tony Ferguson has 1 or 2 great fights left in him. I genuinely think his bodywork and his aggression can really do some great wonders against Dariush, but I'm not too sure how he's going to respond to being control grappled. Against Ferreira, Dariush really showed off his takedowns and control on the mat. I'm not too sure how Ferguson's going to react to that. Dariush isn't necessarily the athletic genius that other fighters are, and so I can imagine Ferguson really piling on the damage on Dariush, and Dariush having grit his teeth once again to enter into the pocket. I think Dariush comes in usually with the right ideas, and I think looking at the Gaethje fight, he can really try to figure out the right counters. Ferguson tends to keep his head up, and I'm sure Dariush will be able to find a way to counter his straights. So when I'm watching this fight, I'm not really sure how I'm going to be calling it. I truly think that Tony Ferguson is a good fighter. I don't see him rising up to the occasion against a fighter on Beneil Dariush's streak. I think this is a particularly tough matchup for Tony Ferguson, and I can see him taking a 3rd loss in a row. Between 2 fighters that can scramble well, but also apply the pressure whenever they feel like it. I'm not sure how Ferguson is going to respond fighting with a back foot. Ferguson has seemed more gun-shy in recent fights, and his issues in the pocket are still exactly the same. Dariush has shown he's been able to land when exiting the clinch against James Vick, and I'm sure he's going to be looking at the Gaethje fight as an example of how to land on Tony Ferguson safely and without accepting his pressure game. Dariush is certainly one of the more impressive fighters, given his lack of athleticism, and I like to see him get a decisive win over a big name in the lightweight division. I'm not sure how he matches up with the upper names in the division. I can see him really struggling against a powerhouse like Gaethje and struggling to hold off takedowns from Chandler. But either way, I'm super excited for this matchup, and I'm sure it'll be great. So we're just about finishing up our painting. I'm just going to add some lead belcher all over the metallic gun parts and also the boots, adding some Mournfang brown on the belt and some Vallejo blue on the pants. I'm more or less just tidying up the little details. So now let's talk about Edson Barboza versus Shane Burgos. I think this is a particularly strange but violent fight for both fighters. Burgos plays really well into Barboza's weaknesses, and I think the onus is on Burgos not to slip up. Against Emmett, Burgos kept running forward and eating right-hand shots to left hook without any regard for Emmett's power. I think Burgos has the right tools to take on Barboza. I'm not too sure how he's going to enter the pocket and really pressure Barboza. Against Emmett, he showed the right idea by kicking the legs and going to the head later on. But again, his defense is very poor, and I don't really see how he's going to enter the pocket without making some major changes to his style. For Barboza, it's going to be the same call as usual. Move around the cage, go for low kicks, and really try to counter punch. Burgos is particularly poor at defending low kicks, so I think this might be a really great fight for Barboza to show off his famed leg kicks. But at the same time, Barboza at featherweight has seemed far more fragile and more gun-shy. I'm not too sure what's the right path for Barboza, given his track record of really suffering under pressure. It seems like with every new fight, he fights another pressure fighter, and this time I think this plays into Burgos' hands. Burgos does come with a major asterisk that he tends to dumb down his own game plan towards his opponent. He can obviously rise up to the occasion, but at the same time, I don't expect too much out of a fighter who tends to walk forward with his head straight up and get clocked by Emmett. So for this fight, I think I'm going to take Barboza by a split decision, and I think this will be an incredibly ugly fight, because Burgos has always been pretty inconsistent with his head movement and tends to get cracked, and I can seriously expect Barboza to hurt him off of a right hand, or to simply back away and body kick him over and over again, and try to make a repeat of the Hooker fight. I find it ironic that now that Barboza is moving down to featherweight, he's fighting one of the largest featherweights ever. Burgos could easily be a lightweight, and I can see this easily have been a lightweight affair. I didn't mention it earlier, but I added some Tesseract glow to the tubes and to the guns of my grots because I wanted to give the sense of this weird sort of green energy emanating from their weapons. I also painted up the boots and added some brown to the belt. Overall, I found the paint job a lot easier now that the parts were all split up. The end result was that a lot of the arms were a lot closer to the chest than I thought, and so I made the right decision when I decided to paint them all separately. A lot of the gluing was pretty self-explanatory, but I still had to take my time and make sure I wasn't scratching any of the paints off, because the glue tends to wear out some of the paints, and it's a really big struggle to try to repaint them all over again. And with that, all of our fights have now been called and predictions made. In my first 2 practice trials, I found it really difficult to glue the painted parts together, and I think this is because the glue has to eat through the paint in order to attach to the other side. So for this paint job, I particularly didn't paint the areas where I think connection was going to be made, and it turned out it made the gluing a lot easier. I think I did a relatively good job with the paint job, however, I still think my blending and my highlights can be a little bit better. And with that out of the way, that's another episode of Painting and Fighting. I really hope you guys liked it, and if you really do, please give us a like, comment, or subscribe. Better yet, you can always subscribe to our Patreon. Starting at $3, you can get access to all of our exclusive content and fund this show. Thank you guys so much. Enjoy the fights.